You're not really talking about like the UN already, but this was the city, so there's mainly people.
That's pretty good.
This was city, but now this one actually still.
No.
This is Dr. Yiorgo Topalidis with the Samuel Proctoral History Program, Mississippi Freedom Project. So I'm going to begin by asking you what your name is and what is your date of birth.
It's Larry Rubin, and it's actually Larry Wolf Rubin, and it's June 23rd. No, it's June 23rd. It's June 23rd, 1942.
Okay.
I was 80 years old 3 weeks ago.
Happy birthday. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The answer to both. Such as I did grow up, it was in Philadelphia.
Okay. What are the names of your parents and where were they born?
They're both from Philadelphia, too. And it's Aaron and Leona Rubin.
Okay.
My mother's maiden name was Freed, Leona Freed.
They also grew up there in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What are the names of your grandparents and where were they born?
All my grandparents were born in Russia, what was then Russia. On my mother's side, it's now Poland. And their names were Marcus Freed and Pauline. And on my father's side, they were born in Berdichev, which is a town in the Ukraine. And my grandfather's name was Abraham, and my grandmother's name was Fagala, or Fanny. Both my grandfathers died when I was 4, and so I really don't remember them. But my grandmothers were a big part of my growing up.
Till what age did you know your grandmothers?
Well, I was in college. It's probably, I would say, the late 20s.
Okay.
And they passed away.
Okay. Did they talk to you at all about like the reasons for them moving to the United States from Russia?
No, which is very common. But I majored in college in Eastern European Jewish history, in part because they didn't talk to me much, and I wanted to learn as much as I could where I'm, my roots, because the roots literally do not exist anymore. I mean, there's no hometown for me to go to. Everything was destroyed. But my mother told me some stories about her side. My mother's mother's family, which was, I think their name was Daglin. After the 1905 revolution, they were very active, I don't know if they were Bolsheviks or what, but a Jewish czarist spy ratted them out. What they were doing was they had a little bakery and in Minsk, or Pinsk, I forget. And they would put leaflets in their loaves of bread, anti-czarist leaflets. So a spy ratted them out and they killed him. And so they had to leave immediately, and they just escaped. On my father's side, they were very, very poor, just dirt poor. No, I should say, let me get back to my mother's side before I leave this out. I'm talking about my mother's mother, I just said. My mother's father was also from Poland, and either from Minsk or Pinsk, I can't remember. was one of 5 siblings, and they all moved to England. My grandfather, Marcus, did I give his name earlier, the first name? Marcus,
Yeah.
went to work for a movie company in England and was a makeup person. And he's the only one that came to the United States, all to Philadelphia directly. It's before he had to go through Ellis Island. And opened up beauty shops, and he ended up owning 3 beauty shops in Philadelphia. And my mother was a beautician, as I said. But he lost everything in the Depression. And he literally went nuts. He was institutionalized. My mother was an artist. These are all her paintings.
Wow. Her paintings. I'm curious, were you told anything about their migration, if they stopped anywhere along the way prior to coming to the United States?
Well, because I had an interest in this, on my father's side, they sailed from Bremen, Germany, which is also very common. And I have the ship's log, and I have a census. This is from my father's side, from Philadelphia. 2 censuses, where they talk about were they literate, and they were illiterate in 3 languages: Yiddish, Russian, and English. My father's side, as I said, came from Berdichev. They were very, very poor, and they moved to America, and they accomplished the same thing, staying very, very poor. They pushed a push cart in Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, fruit push cart. And I remember my grandmother doing that. I don't remember my grandfather.
Did your mother share with you any stories about herself or her parents passing any stories to her about them experiencing prejudice or discrimination in Philadelphia?
No. As I said, the story that I told about my mother's family escaping, killing this Zohar, that was from her. It could be a myth, a family myth, but that's what she said. On my father's side, they really didn't talk about anything. On my father's side, my grandmother never did learn English. And they lived in a very insular Jewish community. At one time, South Philadelphia, where they lived, had the 2nd largest Jewish community in the country, outside of New York. So it was a very large Jewish community. So, I mean, they did suffer prejudice, but they might not have been aware of it. It's like segregation. A lot of black folks grew up segregated, but they lived within a black community, so they never really noticed, except that when you speak to a white person, you speak a certain way. And it was the same thing, when you speak to a Gentile, you speak a certain way,
Were they active at all in the labor movement?
Both my mother and father were, yes. In fact, that headline, which I'll show you, wasn't entirely wrong, which I'll show you later. They met in the YCL, the Young Communist League. My parents did. And my father was very active in the labor movement. And he was a welder. He was a construction worker. And he helped organize the union in Philadelphia. And one thing he always fought for was to have blacks involved in the apprenticeship program. The construction unions were then, not so much now, although there's still a lot of this, racist. And as a matter of fact, if you were not Irish, you couldn't get into the carpenters union. If you weren't also Irish, you couldn't get into the steamfitters and welders union too. except my father and his brother-in-law probably were the two Jewish welders in the entire city of Philadelphia in the Union. But he was beaten up quite a bit because he always said that if we don't bring blacks into the apprenticeship program, nobody's going to hire us because they can hire the non-union people cheaper. You know, so for our own self-interest, we have to organize everybody. And as a matter of fact, he was involved in a big incident during World War II. He worked in the shipyards of Philadelphia. He worked in a, what they call that, a major industry, essential industry, and he was also diabetic, so he wasn't drafted, those two things. But he brought a black person into the shipyards to work. And that was a big incident at the time, but the guy stayed.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of your feelings in seeing your father and mother being involved to the capacity that they were? How did that make you feel as a child?
Well, in the early, when I was first growing up, I came to realize that what they were involved in was different from the neighbors. I didn't quite understand it, but I just knew we were different. Then in the late 40s came the McCarthy period. And then I definitely, you know, I was given orders, you know, don't say this and don't say that to anybody. It was my job when the FBI came to the door to tell them nobody was home, which they did, you know, relatively often. But how that made me feel was distrustful of the world, except for my own family and people in you know, similar situations. By the late 40s, basically everybody had quit the Communist Party, but they still stayed in the same social circles. And you know, we were harassed by the FBI, and my father was fired from the job. And, well, they weren't party members exactly, but and we all had a camp that we went to, all the families in Philadelphia. It wasn't like New York. So you could grow up like I'm describing in New York and never feel fear because there was big left-wing communities, left-wing building complexes. But in Philadelphia, there wasn't. We were isolated from each other in different parts of Philly. So, you know, you felt fear day to day. And as a kid, I didn't exactly understand why, but I did know the world was out to get us, which they were. I mean, this was not paranoia. You turn on the television and they're telling you the communists are, you know, evil, and there's FBI shows, you know, arresting people like my parents, you know. I didn't understand the content of it, but I did know the world was out to get us. So the only times I did not feel that way was when I went to camps, family camps. There's just one in Philadelphia where we all gathered. And then there was a club called Teens Ahead, where, you know, people like me got together once a month at a YWCA. And I went to summer camps, mostly with kids from New York. And, you know, I felt a real sense of community. So maybe the answer to your question is, the way it made me feel was two ways. Distrustful of the world, which was out to get us, but seeking and finding real community. And the closest that I know of people not situated like me that found such communities was religious communities, which of course we were not religious.
Continuing with these demographic questions, what race do you identify as?
Well, I'll tell you a story about that, but first I'll tell you, I don't know. I mean, I belong to a demographic that doesn't exactly exist anymore, except among people my age that remember this. I was brought up in a very poor community. It was slums, but I didn't know that at the time in Philadelphia. You know, it was just the way it is. And we were Jewish, but we were surrounded by, it was just a little community, we were surrounded by a black community, and big Irish community, Polish. So I didn't think in terms of race at all. I mean, there was Jews, and then there was the Goyim. And there was different types of Goyim. There was Irish, blacks, Italians, Slovaks. But we didn't distinguish blacks from anybody, other types of Goyims exactly. So the race thing wasn't there until I came south, which I'll deal with in a minute, where you're either black or white. And I did not understand that. I was not brought up, colorblind. I'm not saying that. A lot of people say, oh, I was colorblind. I wasn't colorblind, but it was just different groups of people, and they were all out together, so it kind of was the McCarthy period. And so one wasn't all that different from any other.
You mentioned the term Goyim. When was your first sort of exposure to that term? Who taught you that word? And who sort of influenced you to think of the world in these terms?
Well, I talked about people coming to get me. When I was 8 days old, they came to get me. And they did something to me that, lasted my whole life. So I must have started somewhere in there.
Okay.
No, I'm saying that I don't remember. But it was just, in the air.
Okay. I was going to say it's a part of the conversation in the home. It was okay.
I was being the wise guy, but you understand.
I understand, yeah. What nationality do you identify as?
Jewish. I mean, my parents came from the Ukraine and Russia and Poland, but in fact, it kept changing. Sometimes it was Lithuania, sometimes it was Russia, sometimes it was Poland. But none of these nationalities considered them part of the nationality. They were Jews. And they didn't consider themselves Ukrainians or Polish or Russian. They were just Jews. To me, I was brought up to believe, I'm sorry, I'm rocking. I was brought up to believe that, to know that Jews are an ethnic group. That Judaism is the religion, the primary religion of that ethnic group, but not all Jews believe in Judaism, and many Jews are atheists. I was brought up in the very big and growing today tradition of secular humanist Jews, except we didn't have that word then. We were just Jews. We just didn't believe in stuff that others did, but we were as Jewish as them. And I went to synagogue every now and again, just, for fellowship. And
that was actually my next question. What ethnicity do you identify as?
Jewish.
Jewish.
Yeah.
What is your sex?
Very little. I'm 80 years old. That's something I've been trying to deal with. Male. I mean, you're asking questions that are relevant today, but when I grew up.
Okay. What gender do you identify as?
Well, it's the same, I guess.
Okay.
I have to tell you, I'm being a little facetious. It's true, when I grew up, these weren't questions, But you see that little boy there in the back in the blue?
Yes.
He's my grandkid, and he's 8. And he says that he is non-binary. And he lives in LA, and he doesn't understand that that's unusual to say.
Well, I guess it's not in LA.
No. And to none of our family. I mean, it's,
Do you subscribe to a religious faith, and if so, which one?
Well, to me, the answer would be no, but I am part of the Jewish tradition. If you came to services that I would go to, you might not be able to tell the difference between what we're doing and what religious Jews would do, except that we don't talk about God blessing this and that. We say we bless this and that. Sort of Jewish Unitarians, or maybe Jewish Quakers. But I was about that. You asked me a question, and I said I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. And what was
Your racial identity.
racial identity? Oh, yes. When I was down, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but I probably forget. When I was a civil rights, voter rights organizer here in Holly Springs, Senator Eastland got me drafted. I didn't know it was Senator Eastland at the time, but researchers in later years showed me that the reason I came down here with a student deferment and in 1 week became 1A, which was no deferment, and then drafted, was Senator Eastland. Anyway, so I go up to Philadelphia to my draft board because I was drafted. And so the way it works is, at least at the time, you went through a series of rooms. So at first, everybody was together, and they gave you a form to fill out. And one of the questions was race. That's where I'm getting at. So I wrote human. And then they send you to various doctors. One looks up your butt, you know, in one room, and then like that. And so one of these doctors, and they're handed the pile of papers. So one of these doctors, I could tell he came to my paper, and you know, what is this? And he came up to me, and he said, "Oh, an intellectual." He said, "Why did you put human?" You know, and you know, it's just for identification. You know, it's not to discriminate. It's just identification purposes. You know, if you get killed, we help you identify. If you lose your dog tags. So I said two things. I said, first of all, I don't care if you identify me or not when I'm dead. That's your problem. I really don't care. You know? And number two, and then I gave him the whole SNCC thing. You know, I just came up. I'm working, you know, voter rights in Mississippi, and I literally had just driven up, and you know, so I'm being consistent, you know, like that. So that's. I've only been asked once the race question that meant anything, and that was that instance, and that's how I answered it.
And so before we move more towards the political atmosphere and everything, I wanted to ask, in Philadelphia, do you feel that you had more fellowship with your ethnic community or with your class community, if you know what I mean?
I know exactly. And what I said before is I really come from a community that doesn't exist anymore, which is working class Jews. I mean, you know, my father, I said, was a welder, and the people around me were cab drivers and janitors, you know, and they consider themselves workers, you know, working class. But because of my parents' activities, I was very aware of class. And so the real answer to your question is I felt most comfortable with, and at these camps and so forth, the majority of people were working class Jews. So it was the same thing. As a matter of fact, it took me a while to understand that there were non-working class Jews. You know, that there were professionals. I don't think I ever met a kid whose parents had graduated from college until I went to college. And there was, and some Jewish kids, you know, parents graduated, I didn't know that such a thing existed. So I understand your question, but I grew up in a little bit different atmosphere. It was just the same.
Who did you vote for in the last national, state, and local election?
Biden, on account of Bernie was not running. State was Ben Jealous, was running for governor of Maryland. And he was endorsed by by Progressive Maryland, by DSA and all that. African-American guy. Came in second to the guy that won, who was a Republican. Passed Larry Hogan. These days would pass for a liberal Republican, I guess. My congressman is Jamie Raskin, who's in the papers a lot these days because he is one of the members of the January 6th committee and is one of the most outspoken members and is constantly put up by Benny Thompson to speak. And I've known him all my life, Jamie Raskin. I used to work for his father. So I was a congressman. A county executive of Montgomery County is Mark Elrich, who just won for re-election, was also very progressive, supported by Democratic Socialists of America and so on, and with whom I served on the Tacoma Park City Council. You see that campaign poster there. I was on a city council for a number of years. But I come from, where I live, right before I moved down here, has to be one of the most progressive counties in the country, Montgomery County, Maryland.
You mentioned the DSA a couple of times before I go on to the next question. Are you an active member in the DSA?
No, although I was an active member just about every left-wing group there was. I was a member of YPSL, which was the Young People's Socialist League, which was the predecessor of, one of the predecessors of DSA. There were several. NAM was another, but I was a member of that. And I was also a member of Progressive Youth Organizing Committee, of the Du Bois clubs and like that. I didn't discriminate in terms of, are you a socialist, a communist, or a Trotsky? I belonged to them all. Except that I was living in Philadelphia, and I always carried in my back seat my Boy Scout uniform, because I was also a Boy Scout. And at that time, Rizzo, who became mayor, was police chief, and would stop you if you looked young for violating curfew. So although I was coming from, let's say, a YPSL meeting, I would say, no, I'm coming from my Boy Scout meeting, look at my uniform.
Who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election?
Which one?
State, local,
Well,
2022.
in Mississippi, this is a Democratic area, one of the few Democratic areas in Mississippi. And I'll vote for the Democrat. I don't know their names yet, although I am now registered to vote in Mississippi and was a voter worker during the primaries. An official of the state, but whoever is a Democrat, because in Mississippi, if you're a Democrat, you're pretty progressive. I can tell you who I hope runs for president next time, Sherrod Brown. Excuse me, that's probably Jamar.
Do I pause this somehow?
What's up?
Oh, no, she paused the recording,
Hey.
I'm guessing.
I just said the universe has to be talking.
Hello.
I just said I was a voter worker in the last primary.
All right.
I saw y'all recording.
Yeah.
Jamar is the election commissioner who gave me that opportunity, which is why I registered to vote.
Yeah.
I just said that because they asked me who am I going to vote for, and I said who's ever a Democrat here in Mississippi.
I just got out of school. I got your call. I text you yes, but you probably didn't.
I know. I wrote back great.
Okay.
Oh, so you did get it?
Yeah.
They're still interviewing. As soon as they're done, that's where we're gonna set up an interview for
Where do
you.
I need to be at?
Just here is good for now.
Bill Scott is being interviewed. You know Bill. He's the head of the, he's the president of the Industrial Development Association of Marshall County, and a former SNCC organizer.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, my boss just walked in to answer that question.
And in high school in Philadelphia, were you politically active at all?
Actually, yes. This was the 50s. I graduated in 1960, but unusual, you know, the group of people that I said was my community, although we lived in different parts of the city, most of us went to the all-academic school. It was Central High and Girls High, which was not neighborhood schools. And a lot of the people that I related to as my community went to these high schools. It was, the Girls High was right across the street from Central, which was all boys. So we all, you know, and we picketed Woolworths when, and this was from that group Teens Ahead that I mentioned. When it was actually before the sit-ins, but we picketed Woolworths up there not because they wouldn't serve blacks, but because they wouldn't hire blacks. Serve anybody, take their money, but they wouldn't hire them. And we picketed Chief of Police Rizzo for all sorts of things. And we also went to the first March on Washington, which was for desegregated schools, called for by the same people that called, you know, the 1963 March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph and his crowd. But I was 15 or 16, and we all went to Washington. We went to Washington a lot, actually.
It's pretty nearby.
Yeah. And mostly what I knew about Washington as a teenager was that you go there to demonstrate for one thing or the other. I also, you know, I went to a school, a Yiddish school, which was a left-wing, I didn't go to Hebrew school, I went to Yiddish school, which was a left-wing Jewish school.
And do you feel like this activism was inspired by your parents?
Well, it was in my DNA. I mean, to say inspired is too intellectual. You know, I didn't think about it. I'll give you two other things that we did, which was just, there was no question we would do it. Nobody told us to, but we just did. Two things. Number one, this was the duck and cover era, when they had these drills where, in order to avoid being incinerated by the atomic bomb, which was being dropped by the Russians any day, you jumped up to your desk. It didn't make much sense.
That would do a lot.
Yeah. It was called duck and cover.
That unfortunate. Yeah. Except now it's for active shooter.
And now it's real. See, now it's, the world has changed. It's real. You got to do that. And if I was in school, I would insist my kid does. But at that time, we knew the Russians were not going to drop the atomic bomb on us. That this was just part of the McCarthy period. And we also knew it didn't do it. Actually, duck and cover might help today, in those, but then it wouldn't help. So we refused to do it. And secondly, when they put the words "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance, we wouldn't say it. And we weren't inspired exactly. We just,
Felt like you had to do it.
felt, yeah. And we had notes from our parents excusing us from those things. So.
That was my next question, was going to be, did they support you?
Oh, yeah. No, they wrote us notes. And again, they told us, don't say this and don't say that to the outside world, because they're out to get us. So if you can screw them up a little bit, that's good too.
So next set of questions more about sort of the formative elements of your social activism. The first question I have for you is, have you ever taken any diversity, inclusion, or equality courses in high school, college, or as part of your employment? And if so, how did you feel about such a course or these courses? If you haven't taken one, if you could just sort of speak to.
Well, you're asking questions that are more appropriate of a younger generation. Also, I have spent my entire life working for the civil rights movement or unions. So it wasn't like a corporate thing and you got to be sensitive and all this. Our job was to organize people around these issues. And the closest I came to such a formal course, now I must say I have taught these courses over the years in different situations. The closest I came to taking such was when I worked for the National Education Association, the teachers union, which was a huge union, is a huge union. And so they gave the staff these kind of courses. And actually that's really the first time, I must say, that I ran into anti-Semitism on the job. When I was down here, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but they didn't deal with it. I mean, let me take a step back. I dealt with anti-Semitism from the staff of the National Education Association, who were convinced all Jews were rich and smart. Now comes this diversity training, which I went through, but they didn't mention this at all. And we had an assembly, the whole staff, recapping, this diversity training. What do you think of it? And I raised my hand, and they wouldn't call on me because they knew what I was going to say, because I'd said it several times about you didn't deal with anti-Semitism. And then I kept running different parts of the auditorium, waving my hand. Finally, they called on me, and I said what I said, and there was no response whatsoever. That was the end of the program.
You mentioned you taught some of these courses. Just your feelings about the material, what was taught, how was it received, and sort of the overall the idea of teaching such a course.
The way it is mostly dealt with, which is not the way the things that I do deal with it, is very personal, one-on-one. They teach that what they call prejudice, is more a psychological issue than anything else. Or if you're, white, you have white privilege. And so what you need to do is learn about your white privilege and somehow, I don't know what. So it either ends up you think you're nuts or you think you're guilty if you're white. And if you're black, mostly people say, it's not our job to teach you this. You created the problem. So don't ask me what you should say or do. And so these things kind of fall apart. The way I do it is a little bit different. I talk about racism being systematic and endemic to American society, which means if you're white, you don't have to feel guilty. That's how we were all, that's the system. You're a victim of the system like everybody else. And because you're a victim, there's certain things you're not aware of. So we talk about that. And it doesn't, in the way I teach it, it doesn't start out as a psychological issue. It starts out as an economic issue. Racism was created for economic reasons. And it became so deep in our society that after racism really isn't useful to capitalism anymore. It really isn't. But it's still there because it was so deep. These things take on a life of their own. They're not necessarily useful to and when I say useful, I mean to capitalists that make more money to grow capitalism. Not necessarily useful anymore, but they still do it because of what's her name writes about in caste. It becomes a caste thing, not a class thing, or it's just so deep. It's hard to get rid of. But it started out. It was invented. It's not natural racism. It was invented to exploit people and to keep people apart. Poor whites, poor blacks, which I have seen firsthand here.
When did you first begin to experience more diversity?
Well, although I talked about that I grew up in this insular Jewish community. I mean, we were surrounded by these other communities, and I went to school with everybody but Catholics who went to parochial school. So they were the one, you didn't relate to, but I always.
So you grew up with the diversity, but your closest community was
Jewish,
working class Jewish.
I mean, as I said, I was not brought up to be colorblind, but I was also not brought up to believe that we were better than anybody else. As a matter of fact, I was more or less brought up to believe that, we got to, stay under the radar and stay quiet and make as many friends from diverse groups as possible. You make yourself some black friends and Italian friends and Irish friends, because you're in America. So I just didn't think in these terms. I know the questions you're asking. Maybe if I was younger or coming up, in a little different way, I would give different answers. And I know the answers most people give, but I'm really being honest about how I was brought up.
And it's really important to get your perspective on these questions. My next question is actually related to issues you've already alluded to now during our interview, but we've spoken about them off the record too, and that has to do with your social justice activism. So the next question is, what are you most passionate about, and sort of what is your level of involvement, if you could speak to that, regarding social justice movements?
Well, my level of involvement, as I said, that's what I've done all my life. I mean, I've never had a job and then I've gone out and done social justice. I've always worked in social justice. That's what I do. And if you ask how come, it's really the background that I described. It was just in my DNA. I mean, I was brought up to believe that a mensch, which means a full human being, fights for social justice. That's what you do as a person. And, there was never much thought put into this. That's what I do.
Was there a particular issue that you were most passionate about and most involved in fighting for?
Well, see, the word passion, that's a word used by younger people. We were passionate about changing the world, creating a new society, a society of that was egalitarian, that was diverse, that was sharing, that was not profit-oriented, but people-oriented. And we didn't divide that up into different movements. I wasn't brought up there's a civil rights movement here, a union movement over here, an environmental movement over there. It was all one. And but now you have to choose because you don't have more than 24 hours a day. So it was natural to me when I was in college in the 60s to join the civil rights movement, although I didn't even think of it in those terms, because people my age could be on the front lines actually doing something, not just talking about it. And the one area that was true of was what we called at that time the civil rights movement in the South. So I came first to Southwest Georgia, working with Frank Smith, who Les McLemore was talking about. In fact, a lot of the people that he said in his interview, we shared the same kind of people. And then SNCC sent me here to Holly Springs. So was I passionate about civil rights? Well, when they started shooting at me and I had a duck, yeah, but would I have chosen that as the one thing in all the world? Well, I did, and because that was what was happening. Later, to make a living, I worked for the union movement. So you could say I was passionate about that. But to me, is that more important than environmentalism? No, that's just what I could do. But the passion wasn't in this or that. It was in changing the world.
Along the same lines, was there a particular group that your social activism focused on helping, or multiple groups?
See, that word helping, I get caught in. So much of the talk about social justice today is in terms of altruism. You have to help these people. That's not where I came from. I told you, my father said, if we don't organize everybody, black people included, we're going to get fucked. You got to organize everybody. That means to help them, because help everybody. So I'll jump. Well, if you ask a lot of white kids, I'm talking about the 60s, from the North, why did you go south? They would talk in terms of helping people. They would say something like, in grade school, I was taught that America is the land of opportunity and we're all equal. Then I saw on television Bull Connor turning the fire hoses on, black people, and I was shocked. So I came south to help black people and to make America into what it should be. See, I wasn't shocked when I saw that. I knew that's the way America was. And I came south, not exactly to help black people, but to help the country, because the country at that time, I know this is hard to believe, were being run by a bunch of reactionary racists in the 60s. And the reason that it was being run by reactionary racists was because they kept getting reelected. Senator Eason here, and the reason they kept getting reelected was because many of their constituents, and in some cases the majority of their constituents, could not vote. So if blacks gained the power to vote, they would vote these sons of bitches out. And those were the people that were taking apart the New Deal for which my parents fought. They were ruining union rights. They were ruining Pell Grants. They were ruining everything that my parents fought for. So I didn't come down exactly to help anybody. They were doing perfectly well without me, I can tell you. But I did come down to fight for myself, to make a better world. And we knew that we also knew that every advancement that was made in this country was pushed for in the majority by the black community. And that even the union movement, which was primarily white, which was racist, didn't make real advances until blacks pushed their way into that. Then the union movement became progressive. So, I look to the black community, which that's a meaningless term. I'll tell you, honestly, I look to Paul Robeson as my leader to make things okay in this country, and Paul, just tell me what to do. I don't know if you understand what I just said. Paul Robeson, you know who that is? So
if you'd like to discuss.
Well, see, this is a young crowd. Paul Robeson was, to say my hero growing up, again, is too intellectual. But he was everybody's hero of my crowd. He was a movie star. He was an opera singer, he knew Shakespeare. He was a lawyer.
What was his background? Where was he from?
New Jersey.
What was his identity?
Oh, he was black. He was a leader of what we now call the Black Power movement. He was one of the great forerunners. He was from New Jersey, but his parents were from North Carolina, and his grandfather or father was an enslaved person. And this guy was just a giant. I met him a few times as a kid. He was a giant physically, for one thing. He was very tall. But he was a lawyer. He was a 4-letter athlete, first black guy to go to Rutgers to win everything. President of his class, valedictorian, whatever. And he was a communist. And he was one of us. And he fought for peace in the world. And he was red-baited. He was blacklisted. He couldn't work for years, as an entertainer. He had his passport taken away from him. He couldn't travel, But that all meant that he could come to my summer camps and I could meet him. He also, during the Spanish Civil War, and I'm telling this story just to give you a picture of him, which is why I say, Paul, just tell me what to do. What I mean by that is the black, see, to us, and it was naive and stupid and a little racist, but to us, he represented the black community, which he didn't. But during the Spanish Civil War, he stopped both sides of the war for long enough to hear a concert that he was giving. He went into no man's land and gave a concert. And both sides, the fascists and the nationalists stopped, the Republicans stopped the war. I mean, so that was him. And he had a tremendous influence on my life. I can't say I was inspired by him, because again, this inspiration is, to me, intellectual. You got to figure out to take it in and how to bring it down to your gut. To me, it was just, that's what we did.
How did your family respond to learning that, of your inclination to be an activist, to be, involved in a social justice movement?
Well, that's very funny, because I always told them, it's those songs you taught me growing up. If it wasn't for the goddamn songs, I would be making a good living. Mom and Pop, this is your fault, what I'm doing. I got this from you. Except that when I went south, the only thing I told them was that the FBI supported what we were doing.
What songs, before we move forward, what songs are you talking about?
Joe Hill, Solidarity Forever, Which Side Are You On? I have a whole book of such songs. I mean, If I Had a Hammer, Pete Seeger, who I got to know, they taught me the Pete Seeger songs, and that's the songs I'm talking about. And
So you're
Go
saying,
Down Moses and like that.
You were saying the FBI.
So I told my parents that the FBI supported what we were doing, which was technically correct, because we were doing voter registration work. So all they knew about the fear is the FBI. They didn't understand Southern sheriffs. So I came down. Then I got arrested. This was in Southwest Georgia, the first time I was arrested. And I didn't want my parents to know. These are, people that set me down. Really, it was from them, But I knew that they, would find out what I'm up to. So I had one phone call. So I called a girlfriend of mine in Chicago, because I didn't want to call my parents or a lawyer or anything that they would find out about. Except that my girlfriend in Chicago spoke to her girlfriend in Philadelphia that night, and this girlfriend in Philadelphia, her parents, played bridge that night with my parents.
Ooh.
And they said, "Isn't it terrible what happened to Larry?" And my parents said, "What are you talking about?" Then they freaked out. For one thing, they called the sheriff. This was in Southwest Georgia, named Zeke Matthews. Now, these Southern sheriffs, I don't think ever dealt with a Jewish mother directly. And they called our congressmen and senators, who then called the sheriff. This poor little sheriff didn't know what hit him. It still kept me in jail, didn't do much good. But that's when I told my parents that, I'm down here because of you. And that's when they had to come to grips with the danger. And at first they freaked out, but then they became very active in Friends of SNCC in Philadelphia, and were red-baited on the radio because of that. They were caught out in Philadelphia, which they were kind of used to. But now it was, the whole communism was sort of intellectual. It wasn't really about much. Really what they did is sit around, sing songs. My father helped organize a union, but it wasn't a communist union. It was, just a regular business union. But now it's real stuff. People are shooting at people. And so they came to grips with it.
You mentioned your parents. What about your spouse?
Oh, I didn't have one at the time.
In your involvement as, a social justice, in the social justice movement.
Which one?
All of them. How did they react to your involvement?
Well, it was sort of I've been divorced 3 times, and I'm on my 4th. Not exactly marriage, but I call it marriage because that's really what it is. So, a criteria for getting together with me had to be that they were involved in one level or the other. But so they always supported what I was doing, but after 3 marriages, I have been told it's you. It's not them, it's you. It was me, after 3 times. And so I was never very good at, family and marriages, because all I knew about was the movement. And I shortchanged my kids until, say, 10 years ago, when I got to know them better and apologize for not being there, because I was always, doing movement stuff. And I lost 3 wives. Not 100% for that, but it played a large role that I was myself in the movement. This relationship stuff is harder. They can shoot me and beat me up, but don't look at me like that. Your look, I can't deal with that. I'm going to South where all they do is shoot.
Do you have any anecdotes from those moments with one of your wives where the movement sort of played a role, in?
Well, yeah. There's a lot of anecdotes with the labor movement, because that's how I was making my living. I was a full-time union organizer and publicist and writer. And basically I would be away when an important family thing happened. But this kind of sums it up, I guess. My 3rd wife, I had to go. This is after the movement. After the 60s, it sort of echoes and reflections of the movement. Not the union movement, but civil rights. So I went to a reunion, which I helped to organize here in Mississippi. And it was the 45th, maybe it was the 50th, I think it was the 50th reunion. And my wife wanted to go with me, but I didn't want to take her because she didn't know all these people, and I put them first and me first because I wanted to relate with them, tell old stories and tell each other the lies that we've been telling each other for 50 years. You know. So I told Fran, I can't take, you can come, but I won't be able to take care of you. You just have to push yourself out, and, which was unfair to ask, and she wouldn't do it, didn't come.
Yeah.
And this is a bad thing I'm talking about, and this is very common. And in fact, the two people that did not get caught up in that is Bill Scott. I'm talking about keeping families together, and how SNCC is not very good at it, except for Bill Scott, who did.
56 years of marriage and still hanging out.
God bless. Yes, you will testify. It's very unusual.
It's very unusual.
And Les was able to keep it together somewhat, you know. But the rest of us were wrecks. Our personal lives are a mess.
Well, you mentioned that your activism was kind of part of a passed down tradition, and you mentioned you having 3 kids. So are any of them involved in any way?
Well, no, and one is black. That's my daughter there. And the answer is no. And I think there's 2 parts to that. One, I wasn't around. When I was doing movement stuff, I was elsewhere. And 2, I think I was trying to spare them the pain of going through what I was going through in the movement. Now, today, just recently, I think they've come to understand what I'm doing. That's my other daughter and my grandkids. The 2 of them have come to understand what I was doing and to think it was pretty cool. But that's just recently. And see, I'm still at it in a way. I moved here. And you notice my wife is not here, or my partner. I haven't yet convinced her to come down, although she's been here. But so I have to split my time between here and Bethesda, Maryland, which is an improvement for me. I didn't just walk out. I'm trying to make things work out. But unfortunately, the answer is no. And that's also unusual. A lot of the kids of SNCC people really did get involved. And there's a whole 2nd and 3rd generation of SNCC folks. One of whom is Bakari Sellers, from CNN, the talking head. His father worked here, Cleveland Sellers. And there's other folks. In fact, Cleveland Sellers is in that book that I gave, that green book. But I was never able to manage that.
You mentioned you moved here again for the movement. What is your level of involvement today? Are you also financially supporting any particular social justice movement here?
No, I don't have the finances. I have very little. I did not gear my career towards making money.
So in what capacity are you currently involved?
Well, several things. Now, I moved back to Holly Springs specifically because when I was an organizer here, I was, first of all, here the longest, and I got to know the community the best, aside from other communities that I worked in the South, probably because I had a lot of experience when I came here. I'd been in the South like 5 years. And I actually did stuff here. I organized a union. I helped organize the union here.
Which one?
It was a laborers' local of the brick making factory up the road. Now the union no longer exists, but that's a whole story, getting black and white workers together, which will go to your class question. I'd like to tell that story. But to answer your question, what I'm doing today, I'm continuing with projects that I was peripherally involved in over the years with Russ College. bringing in speakers, working with students on various issues of voter registration among students, for example. And we're just starting a new organization of which Jamar is vice president, and Tyresha was here earlier as president, and Wayne is CEO. It's called North Mississippi Roots and Wings. And there's a lot of bells and whistles involved, and we have the potential to work in a lot of areas. But bottom line is to help the economic development of this area. And Bill, I'm sure, spoke about that because he's the head of the Industrial Development Authority. And this area is booming, is about to boom economically. To help that process, Holly Springs has to have something to offer so people will live here. A lot of the new workers coming in don't live in Holly Springs, they live in other towns. And what Holly Springs has to offer the world naturally is African American history and culture. It's here. I mean, all sorts of studies have shown that what Holly Springs has to offer is that. Ida B. Wells and a lot of other stuff. Work we did right after World War II, there was a lot of vets came back to this area, northern Mississippi, and because northern Mississippi, in part because the rust, like Les was saying, was not quite as dangerous as other areas, there was the opportunity to make a lot of progress. Although it was very racist and dangerous to talk about voter registration, there was virtually no blacks registered to vote, even here, you know. So North Mississippi Roots and Wings, in general, the goal is to create let's call it a Williamsburg. In other words, a town based on its own history and culture, but open to everybody. So whereas Williamsburg is based on the white history and culture, and the colonists, well, it should be based on African American too, but that's something different. And although Holly Springs, which has more antebellum houses, and more extant slave quarters than any other city, has put out its white identity and its white culture and its white history to attract people. What we're trying to do is create black history and culture open to everybody in Holly Springs. Because that's really what we are in reality. If you study it, black people built the town. Colonel Beauregard Lee did not. Might have owned a plantation. So that's what I'm involved in. And that's what the organization is aiming to do in a very general way. But that breaks down into a lot of different things.
So why did you find yourself back at Holly Springs?
When?
Why?
Oh, well, for the reason that I said, that I had been in and out of Holly Springs for some 60 years, working on various projects after I left SNCC. And I felt a real love for the town. And also the town is strange. Holly Springs is weird in a lot of ways. It doesn't fit into the normal, stereotypical small southern town. Although in some ways it does. In some ways it doesn't, and I am attracted to such things. One of the first things that happened when I got here was this move to change the name of Memphis Street to Ida B. Wells Boulevard. And this is a typical weird story. I was involved when the issue first came up, which was 3 or 4 years ago, as one of the projects that I was working on at Russ College. We should change the name of the main street to Ida B. Wells Boulevard. Main Street is Memphis. The white community, which is 15% of the demographics, said no. You know, because this is part of now the black oppression that's being laid on us. You keep forgetting about us whites. So the movement kind of died. So now, last year, it was started up again by Reverend Leona Harris, who I hope you will interview. I hope she will come. She is the founder and curator of the Ida B. Wells Museum. And what she said was, the street that the Ida B. Wells Museum is on, which is Randolph Avenue, we should change to Ida B. Wells Street. Randolph was the founder of the town. He was a slave trader and a cotton producer. And he founded Holly Springs to be the business center of the cotton industry in Mississippi, which meant it was a big slave trade here, and that was just god-awful. So, no, we're not going to change the name of Memphis. We're going to change the name of Randolph. So now the white community is all up in arms about changing the name of Randolph, because, see, that's really one of theirs. We got all sorts of great-grand-nieces. One thing about Holly Springs is that there's a disproportionate number of families that did not move away, or parts of the families. So we have a disproportionate number of black families who trace their genealogy back to enslaved people, and whites to the enslavers. So the Randolph family said, no, you can't change the name of that. He founded the town, and he's my great-great-grandpappy or whatever. Change the name of Memphis Street to Ida B. Wells. That's what I mean by weird. So, now it was, the black community was split. Are you hearing what I'm saying, Jawar? Do you disagree with anything?
Real important with it.
If I'm saying it wrong, you tell me, because you were here. Look, so now the black community is split. The NAACP and other groups that originally came out for Memphis to be changed, now they still want Memphis to be changed. But now Leona Harris and others are saying, no, we got to do Randolph. Forget Memphis. So that's the way it came down. And this was the first week I moved here in December. This was the issue before the city council. So I came up with a plan, 3-part plan, which I presented and I wrote a letter, which is, number one, because Memphis is the main street, change it to Ida B. Wells, because that's the first thing people will see when they come to town. And Randolph is hard to find. It's not a tourist thing, I mean, the museum is a tourist thing, but you got to get directions. But number two, change the street signs on Randolph, because one of the issues is it's very difficult to change addresses. So if we change Randolph to something else, keep Randolph address. And by the way, Wayne Jones lives on Randolph Avenue. But underneath each street sign say birthplace of Ida B. Wells. And then people will ask, why is this? Because if you change the name from Randolph, next year people will forget it was ever named Randolph, and it won't mean anything. But if you have the two names there, then somebody can say, he was the slave owner, and she was the slave. And who do people remember today? Old Randolph, Massa Randolph, or do they remember Ida B. Wells? And the third thing is to form a commission to change street names throughout the town. Because we got a Van Dorn Boulevard. He was a Confederate general that was fighting in this area, and he was a slave owner himself. We got all sorts of Confederate names. And we got people who have named Flick Ash, which I personally would like to see changed, because I knew the son of a bitch. He was the sheriff and tax collector, also the state representative. He was everything, and one of the richest whites. And he actually has a lot of support in the black community, because in later years, he made it his business to build support within the black community, because it was good for his business, which goes to the point that we were talking offline before about. The 15% of the white community, a lot of them support changing Holly Springs into a heritage tourism spot for black tourism, and to have lots of African American culture and historical things because you can make money from that. And also because 85% of the current population is black and we want to take their money. So we can't be talking about, hanging a Confederate flag, not in Holly Springs, not that it's going to go anywhere. So it's that. And that's also makes it a little bit different because a lot of these white people I'm talking about are local. Other little towns, the white people that run them are not local. They're not as sensitive to what I'm saying. So it's a strange little town. I love it. And you're looking at the next mayor and governor. I'm not kidding. When you talk, and I'm going to be his, if not campaign manager, assistant campaign manager.
I'm curious, what are the demographics of the local government? Also, this is Laura Tamayo.
Well, it's mostly black. We have one white alderman, but the sheriff, the county sheriff is white, and the county, I'm forgetting what you call it, administrator, he's white, right? Mm-hmm. The demographics of Marshall County they're still majority white, I think.
It's about the population.
Yeah.
It's half and half.
Yeah. That's of all of Marshall County. But Holly Springs in this immediate area is predominantly black, and the government reflects that. Except for the sheriff, but I'm running, I want to support, what's it? Lejeune.
Somebody else running?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
This is Kristin Anderson. Forgot to say that earlier. You mentioned, being in this area around your college years and then being gone and coming back now in your 80s. How did you stay connected to what was going on here? Was it like a person or just like the organization?
Well, no, I kept coming back. I never dissociated from this area at all. When SNCC fell apart, and that's what happened as an organization, I stayed involved in the civil rights movement. In many ways. One way was through Rust College. And I helped Rust organize some festivals, meetings, between black and white, reminiscences of this. Holly Springs was the first governmental entity in Mississippi to sponsor a reunion of civil rights workers. It was here first, then Jackson. And then I got involved with the Rust College, at that time, Rust College / Holly Springs Community Development Corporation, whose main project was what Les talked about. Rust bought MIC property, and our main project was to redevelop it into a center for Black history. And it's continuing now as the Ida B. Wells Social Justice Center. So, I was always involved. And I'll tell you exactly how I got more involved. I was asked to be on a panel in Washington to talk about Ernie Smith, who everybody will agree was the best president Rust ever had. And Les was talking about how he was one of his mentors. He was an amazing guy. Whereas the college across the street, MIC, the black college, would not allow its students to take part in the civil rights movement. Ernie Smith himself took part and encouraged Rust College students to. The State Sovereignty Commission came down on him like a ton of bricks. The Klan threatened him. The Methodist Church, and Rust is a Methodist school, tried to get him to cool it, and he wouldn't. He was a very courageous guy, and he let me live at Rust. Frank Smith, who preceded me here, who was black, and who was on the city council of Tacoma Park, of Washington, D.C., Jamar, and I was his campaign manager.
Wow.
And he stayed on the city council for a long time, but he now runs the African American Civil Rights Museum in Washington. Anyway, so he was here, and I've lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. We were talking about
The panel that brought you back here.
Thank you. So it wasn't me back here. It was in Washington, and it was Frank that put it together. And it was at his museum, Frank Smith Museum, and he had been here. And what I started to say was, when he came as a SNCC worker, Ernie Smith allowed him to live at Rust and pretended he was a Rust student to avoid his being shot at. So if Frank could make it to the Rust campus, he was safe. But he had to tell the white community he's a Rust student. It was very difficult to say that about me at the time, because there were no white students and hadn't been allowed for a long time. But Ernie also allowed me to live at Rust. So that's why I was invited on this panel by Frank. And that's why I admired Ernie Smith so much. And there was a panel of people that admired Ernie Smith. Ernie, knew him, admired him. And as a result of being on that panel, Rust College, people that I didn't know but learned about me, through this panel, asked me to help them develop the Ida B. Wells social justice events. It started out that we wanted to make it the Ida B. Wells Social Justice Weekend once a year. And I came down and I was a panelist on the first. Then it morphed into the Ida B. Wells Social Justice Lecture Series. And that's what brought me to Rust, starting about 5 or 6 years ago, brought me often. Because I knew a lot of people that, would speak from the civil rights movement. And I helped stage the events, and stage workshops and, do a lot of the technical stuff and they call it Jimmy Higgins work, just, mailing envelopes and stuff. So I came often for that. And that was what got me involved in the Rust College / Holly Springs Community Development Authority, because it was seen as an offshoot of this building up Ida B. Wells. Then the pandemic hit and the lecture series became on Zoom, and I did help a little bit, from where I was. And then the administration changed, and the Rust College / Holly Springs CDC no longer existed. They just changed it. But I was in the middle of helping rebuild the MIC and this lecture series, and there's a few other things. So I love the community. So I thought, well, I might as well move here because I'm spending a lot of money on a hotel anyway. And at that time, I thought maybe my wife would move with me, but she still might. So that, I think, answers the.
Yes, for sure. I also wanted to ask, because we spent most of the time talking about your different organizing, and you mentioned that you've done that all the way since high school. Were there other interests or things that you pursued, or any organizations?
Well, I went to Antioch College, which is to say, Antioch encouraged people like me to do what people like me do. And in fact, I organized a union there as well at the college of workers, which didn't all please all that many administrators, but that's what they encouraged. I kind of stuck with what was in my DNA. Most people that have that in their DNA were smart, really smart folks. And they went on to become the leading biologists here, and the leading chemist there, and the leading administrator of this large nonprofit there. They had actual careers because they studied stuff and knew stuff. And I was never a good student, and I never learned much about anything. So I just stuck with what I started with, So yeah, I've never done anything else. I wish I could say, I did it because my passion, was into changing the world. Well, their passion is into changing the world too. But they actually learned stuff and changed the world within their, learning. And me, I never did have, I made up my own, I majored Eastern European Jewish history, but you can't do anything with that. And that was for a BA, So I never really took that farther. I just stuck with what I was born with.
Very learned, degree or not.
Well, thank you.
So, in your involvement with the social justice movements in general, what was your level of participation in protests, and do you have any anecdotes from protesting that you'd like to share with us?
Well, my engagement was great. I mean, that was part of what we did. But SNCC made the decision in 63, actually late 62, 63, to organize, not mobilize. Mobilize is you protest. You get a lot of people together and you raise hell in the streets. But our idea was that still leaves the power in the power structure. We're just protesting. And we're saying, you do something about it. Now, we're saying do something about it or we're going to stay here and raise hell, but that only goes so far. What we said is we are not going to mobilize as much as organize. And organizing means voter registration. It means, in this area, it meant getting farmers to vote in the agricultural stabilization, conservation, county committees, which was to become active in those committees which decided cotton allotments and decided what farmers would not pick and how much they would get. In other words, deal with power in the economy and organize for that. You don't protest, you get people involved. But I was involved in what I believe was the largest sit-in in Nashville at I have a picture of myself in there somewhere, at a lunch counter at a Five and Dime. And they rounded us up. We went there and they threw crap at us, and we were a big group. So, and then the police came and just shoot us out. And then they met with us and they said, who's a member of the Communist Party? And I raised my hand and said, the only thing I'm a member of is the YMCA. And here's my card. And everybody said, yeah, we're members of the YMCA too. That was my contribution to the sit-in movement. Get us out of jail.
And are there anecdotes that you could share with us from mobilizing? From organizing, I'm sorry.
No, I know what you meant.
Sorry.
Well, there's two things. I got arrested a lot here. And in fact, Frank Smith, when he tells the story, he says, nobody would drive with Rubin because he would get arrested. You don't spend a weekend in the jail, you don't drive. And it was, through walking around and driving around, for voter registration work. I got arrested once here for suspicion of carrying literature. No, suspicion of carrying printed matter advocating the overthrow of the state of Mississippi. And I won't stop my story, but I will show you the article. That's what I want to show you. So I noticed I was getting arrested a lot. And I noticed that every time I got arrested, the sheriff, Flick Ash, would say, you know, it's $100 fine. You know, just give me the money and you won't have to go to court and I'll take care of it. And I always would, because we didn't want to be in jail. We wanted to be out organizing. But then it occurred to me, this happened every time. And it occurred to me that I had to become a cottage industry of Flick Ash. Because I never got no paper saying he got rid of it. Never even thought about it. I don't know how much money I gave him over the years. Then I was arrested during the day of the ASC, that's what we said for short, the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Community, you know, the day of the elections for these committees. And we had organized like hell for that. And people down here were reacting to that for or against, more so than even voter registration, because it spoke to their bread and butter. And so it was the day of the vote, and I was going from voter site to voter site to make sure that African Americans, and by the way, you didn't have to register, all you had to do was work the land. Sharecropper, anybody could go and vote. And I was just making sure that people walked in and could vote. I was driving around, and Flick stops me, and he didn't know exactly why at first. Because, you see, we weren't arrested for voter registration. We were arrested for, hey, a shirt like that was stolen from the haberdashery yesterday. Where's your sales slip? You might have been the one to steal the shirt. Or, you know, your headlight is out. You know, like that. So he stopped me. He knew he wanted to keep me off the road, but he didn't have his act together. So he stopped me and he started to walk around the car. And he said, mash down on your brights. Now, at that time, the button for the brights were in the bottom of the car. And you had to mash it down. You didn't push it or whatever. So I did that. He said, well, you know, the law says that from the time you mash it down to the time the lights go on, it should be 15 seconds. I just timed you and it's 20 seconds. So you're on there. I said, Flick, it's the middle of the afternoon. It's 2 p.m. You don't need brights. That's the best he could come up with, though. So he arrested me for that. And he said the same thing. He said, okay, fine is $300. Give me the money and get out. But I had gone through this process of reasoning. I said, no, Flick, I am not going to give you that money. You're going to have to keep me in jail. I know you don't want to, but I'm not going to give you the money. You're going to have to spend money on me, feeding me, instead of me giving you money to spend. So he says, how about $100? He's negotiating with me. I said no. So I stayed in jail overnight. And then he brought in the prosecuting attorney from Tupelo, which is, I don't know why exactly, but he, you know, tried to reason with me. He got down to $5. Just give us $5, you can go. And I said no, and I told him the story. I have figured out I have given Sheriff Ash there X amount of money. That's the last penny he's going to get from me. You're going to have to bring me to trial for not having a bright that goes on fast enough at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. You're going to have to do that. I'm perfectly happy here in jail. You know, for one thing, there's no danger here. So they let me go, but that's the last time I gave him a fine for being arrested by organizing. But I want to tell you another story. And that maybe this is a good way to sum it up. Because tomorrow, his time is valuable.
Well, we have another available camera.
Oh, okay.
Too, so
Good.
we can continue.
Okay, well, this, to me, so we were living at the Freedom House. Have you seen where that is?
I don't think so.
Well, it's right across the street from Rust. The house no longer exists, but there's a big monument there. So, well, if you have time, I'll take you over there. It's on a small street right across the street from Rust. It's called Rust Avenue. And we're in the Freedom House. And it was around the time that the 3 civil rights workers had been killed, that had been acknowledged to be killed. We knew that they had been killed the day they didn't report in. But that's a whole other story about how we got the FBI to fess up. So, and then a 4th person got killed too, Wayne Yancey. And he was here in Holly Springs. And Flick Ash killed him. And it's a whole other thing. It never came to justice for it. But anyway, so 4 people had been killed. And we were sitting in the Freedom House, and it struck us as hilarious that we were going to be killed next. We were sure our time had come. And we thought it was very funny because we knew we weren't agitating. It was the people, they were picking on the wrong people to kill us. We thought that was hilarious because we weren't doing nothing. We were just helping out, you know. And we're laughing, and there was a voice called out from the street. It was about midnight. And it was a deputy sheriff. And he screamed, "Rubin, come out here." So we're in the middle of knowing we're going to get killed sometime soon, you know. And I had in my mind, okay, well, this is my time, you know. Plus, which we didn't want the community to feel we were afraid of the police. So I went out. I forgot the guy's name. I wrote it down somewhere. I forgot the guy's name. But he had arrested me and beat me up a couple of times. So I got in the car, and he's driving north into the at that time was Piney Woods. It was old Route 70, is it? Anyway, the route is still there, but it's not a main, but at that time it was just as one country road. And he's taking me out there in the Piney Woods. He didn't say a word, and I didn't say a word, but I was sitting in the front seat. And he's driving me. And I see we're in these woods. And what I had in my mind is how similar this was to the 3 civil rights workers. You know, they were let out of jail, and they weren't driven by a sheriff, but the sheriff is kind of herding them in his car to a certain spot. And this guy was taking me to like a certain spot in the woods, a little clearing. And he pulls over. He hasn't said a word. And I'm just thinking, well, this is it. Now, it's funny to say it this way. Not that I wanted to get killed. I've talked to guys in the Army that go through the same thing. Oh, we know we're going to get killed yesterday. Tomorrow. That's, you know, you go nuts. It's kind of neuroses that sets in. So he turns to me. He says, "Rubin," he says, "are you helping to organize the brick making factory?" So I was talking about earlier. So normally I would lie, you know, to save my ass. You know, I have nothing against lying. But because of this mindset, I said, yeah. So he turns to me, he says, "You keep that up." He says, "My brother works at that factory, and he needs a raise." And he said, and all the white workers are going to vote for the union. They're not going to help you organize, but they're going to vote for the union. You stick with that. And that's class. And for all I know, all the whites were members of the Klan. I don't know. But they needed a raise, and they know the only way they could do that is organizing with the black workers, and who took the burden of organizing, and who met in a church, and the church was burnt down with a union meeting. And the whites didn't do anything, but they did vote for it. And it happened exactly like he said. That's how I normally wind up my speeches when I give speeches about my life. You know, this is to me, the moral of the story is it works. You can organize whites and blacks together for their own self-interest. They don't have to love each other, you know? And that goes back to your question about diversity training, too. I think most people would say they don't care all that much about what people think. They do care about what they do. So if you have all these prejudices and all that, but you hire me and you give me a good money and you just stay out of my way and you treat me with dignity, I don't care if you want to treat me with dignity or not, as long as you do. A lot of people say that. And that's been my experience. I don't care what you say to your wife later.
Can you speak to, in your view, the difference between whiteness as an identity and white supremacy?
Yeah, whiteness is an identity. Hello, I'm white, you know. But white supremacy is God has endowed whites, first of all, to look like God. We know God is white. You know, and Jesus Christ has to be white. You know, we were put on this earth to be the, what's the word? Shepherds of the earth. And among those people that we are responsible for are the lower races, like blacks. Now, we're responsible for them. You know, we take good care of them. They're happy here. I didn't say it the whole way they used to say it, because I can't. I mean, I literally can't. I just can't bring myself to do it. But white supremacy is the certainty that you were put on earth to run it, to rule it. And for good reason, because, you know, you're smarter and whatever than anybody else. But it's also a belief that it's okay to exploit black people because they were put on this earth, you know, to work for you.
So you see a difference between whiteness and white supremacy, or do you think there's an overlap between those two?
Well, there's an overlap. I mean, nobody that believes in white supremacy doesn't also say, hello, I'm white. It's a funny thing. Everybody that has a belief that there's a group that's superior in the world, just by dumb coincidence, happens to be their group. I can't understand that.
What advice would you give individuals who self-identify or can be externally categorized as white regarding participation in social justice movements, organizations, or protests?
You should do it because it is to your self-interest. You are held back educationally, economically, every way by there being a system that there's somebody lower than you. Because the people that are running the system are keeping you down by, you know, the sure knowledge that they can get whatever you want to give them cheaper. And that it runs through the system. And it's, you know, I can demonstrate how that's through everything, education, everything. That's number one. Do it from your own self-interest. Number two, if you're working for a group that is working that is a black group or an immigrant group or a Latinx group, it's their group, and learn to work with them and learn that, in fact, you do not have all the answers just because you're white. And think about why you think you have all the answers. You know, even if people put you in a situation that you think is beneath you, that's your role in fighting for equality if you work for a black organization. And they talk about Freedom Summer. You know, about 1,000 white kids came down. And by the way, Holly Springs had the largest Freedom Summer project. And through this project came a lot of people that became notable later. Are you, Jamar, are you still okay with that? Oh, good, okay. The questions people were asked who applied to Freedom Summer, and not everybody that applied was accepted. Whites. Not all whites that applied to Freedom Summer became part of that 1,000 people. And the two questions that they were asked in great depth by people who knew how to ask it and knew how to hear the answers. There's two questions. What do you think about working for a black person? And they said it that way. You know, working for, you have a black person as a boss. Although SNCC was not about bosses and such, but they said it that way. And the second question was, suppose you who have a PhD from Harvard in nuclear physics, are told what you can contribute to Freedom Summer is licking envelopes 12 days a week, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. You just sit there and lick envelopes and stuff them. Some people bullshitted their way out of the first question, but they have people that understood what they were, they understood the various ways of bullshitting. The second question, most white people said, well, I hope that I can prove myself and, so I'll be given more responsibility. But see, that wasn't the bulk of the question. The question was, will you do what the movement needs you to do? No matter what it is. If we need you to stuff envelopes, would you do it? Not that it's low work. We don't consider that low work. We consider it necessary work. That second question eliminated a lot of people. So that's that's an anecdotal way of answering your question of advice to white people.
The last question I have is related to the memorial sort of conference, the SNCC COFO conference, the booklet that you shared with us earlier. I noticed that in there, a co-organizer was Miss Gloria Clark, and I was wondering if you could speak to your relationship with her as an organizer.
Well, first of all, just to clarify, we all came through SNCC. Gloria did, everybody did. They were organizers, voter rights organizers, all the young people. It was, Freedom Summer volunteers. That's not 100% true. There was a small number of people through CORE. Mickey Schwerner was through CORE. But all the organizations worked together in Mississippi at that time under the rubric, the umbrella of COFO, Council of Federated Organizations. Because SNCC was the most active, a lot of times people confused the two. But so technically we were working for COFO. And Gloria was a volunteer that worked here during Freedom Summer, and she stayed on and she became a SNCC staffer. I was a SNCC staffer before Freedom Summer. I mean, I was sent here to help set up Freedom Summer, not as a volunteer. But I was earning my living that way. It was $9.65 a week. That's $10 after taxes. Listen, I don't know what we did with it. We couldn't afford food on it. But so I met her there, and then I don't know if do you see this shoebox?
Mm-hmm.
That has, you can take it out. Of course, I actually wanted to show it to you too. This is an answer to your question, our relationship.
Yep.
She ran an oral history project. And these are her oral histories of SNCC people and local people. And so our relationship was putting this together. And this took us 10 years.
Is this digitized anywhere? Is it being held anywhere?
Yes, some are digitized
I'm sorry, to rephrase, is there
online.
is there an institution that already has these in its possession
Yes.
and can share them with researchers?
Yes, there are two institutions. One is Russ College that promised to digitalize it, and as far as I know has not done it yet. And then there's, I think it's Southern Mississippi University. Is that SMU? I can answer that question. And they have digitalized many, if not all, and they are available online. I can answer your question very quickly. But we've stayed good friends. And it used to be that at least once a year, we would come to Holly Springs just to, meet the people that we used to work with.
Does she still live here, or
No, she never did. She lives in Florida now, but she used to live in Massachusetts.
maybe we'll talk off record?
Yeah, I have all her contact information.
Okay.
She would be actually a very good person to speak with. Here. I'm looking up the Gloria, I think it's called the Gloria Clark Collection. No, it's not underwear.
Oh, we could look.
I'll look it up.
We could look for it.
Yeah, but I believe it is Southern Mississippi University, and I believe that most are online, but it's those.
Okay.
I have some transcripts that I can send you.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to add to the record that we did not discuss?
Yes, actually, one of the things that makes Holly Springs, makes this area unique, and one of the reasons I moved back, one of the reasons I fell in love with the place, when the civil rights movement started and restarted in the late 50s and 60s, it was called the Civil Rights Movement. And it was, the goal was to make the dream of America come alive. And the dream at that time was a melting pot. We're all, no matter who we are, we can melt into America. Except that that's not really what it meant, and it was not the way it was in practice. When people close their eyes and think of an American, they see a white person. And plus which, nobody wanted to melt, as it turns out. They just wanted to be who they were. But we call it the Civil Rights Movement and the Integration Movement. And that's more or less how it was when I worked in Southwest Georgia. Now I come to Holly Springs. And people here, because of the particular history of Holly Springs, Russ College, a disproportionate number of black landowners, always a powerful community, not compared to the white community. People could not vote. The dangers here were the same way as they were across the country, but they didn't put up with what I just said. And they said, we don't want to melt. We want the black community to be equal to any other community as blacks. And people said that here. And this was in the early 60s. So they were, when I say they, I mean this community, was maybe 5 or 6 years in their thinking ahead of the rest of the people being organized in the South. And still, now I would say 10 or 20 years ahead of most of the country, white or black. So that's, did you have another question?
Yeah, at the beginning you said you were going to tell us about that right there.
Oh.
I didn't want you to forget.
Oh, yeah. So this goes back to the story of that I'm carrying literature, printed material, they didn't say literature, printed material, advocating the overthrow of the state of Mississippi. So what it was, one of my early jobs, aside from setting up what became called Freedom Summer here in Holly Springs, was the Freedom Libraries. Books donated from people in the North to accompany what became known as the Freedom Schools here in the South. So I was hauling books around the country, from, I don't know, Boston to down, to Mississippi. So one of these hauls was in a U-Haul. And I was passing through Oxford, the sophisticated town of Oxford. And it was me and 4 African Americans, 3 of whom are still alive and are very good friends of mine. So we were arrested on that charge because we were carrying these books. The charge, again, being, and they were very particular about this, printed material advocating the overthrow of the state of Mississippi. They didn't even get to the United States, which I told her when he arrested me on that charge, and he had a warrant to search the U-Haul trailer, which said, I have reason to believe and do believe that they are carrying literature, da-da-da-da-da. I said, listen, Sheriff, it was Boy Spratton. I said, if I was going to overthrow something, I wouldn't mess around with Mississippi. I mean, what are you talking about? Because I didn't care. I was a wise guy. And I could hardly understand what they were saying, and they couldn't understand me probably, so it was okay. But anyway, I said that. So he, in fact, opened the U-Haul trailer, and he, in fact, was correct. The books were printed materials threatening to overthrow the state of Mississippi, and it was like the Bobbsey twins, Nancy Drew mysteries. These were books that had been discarded from the North anymore. They were, English texts from 1952, like that. And there is the local paper, the Oxford Eagle, came and took a picture of all this, all the books stacked up, and they said in the paper what the books really were. So anyway, they let us go after 3 days in jail because they could not press the charge of carrying printed material advocating the overthrow of the state of Mississippi. So then we came to Holly Springs, which was where the Freedom Libraries came from. We were loading up all the books at Rust to be distributed, to other places. And then we were arrested again. This time, it was a traffic something. And somewhere between the 2 stops, I noticed that my address book had been stolen. And I didn't mention it at the time because I was just happy, to still be alive. And so we arrested again on a traffic stop. Okay. So now fast forward, it's July 30th. So I must have been talking about June 20-something when this incident with the books took place. The 3 civil rights workers had disappeared, that their bodies had not been, quote, discovered yet, although they were never lost. So Senator Eastland was going around the country saying the civil rights workers were voluntarily disappeared, were laughing it up on Moscow Gold in a New York hotel room. In other words, he was throwing in communists and Jews. Anything in New York is Jews. And he gave this speech in the Senate. And he had my address book. And he starts reading names out of it. Some names actually he read out of there that weren't even in there. You know, and talking about this one was a communist and this one was this and this one for my address book. So this shows that the communists were running the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and they weren't actually after. It wasn't not about equality. It was about overthrowing the state of Mississippi. And the reason he was doing that was for two reasons. You know, because he wanted to hide the fact of the killings by saying it was a communist hoax, but also because by saying it was a communist hoax, he was saying black people in Mississippi were happy here, and if it wasn't for these outside agitators who were lying to them, who were white and communist and Jewish, by the way, everything would be fine. So he gives this speech. The owner of the local newspaper at that time was president of the Mississippi Senate. And I'm blocking his name. You can look it up, Senator. And he owned the local paper. So that's a long story to show you what this is what this means. It says local civil rights worker has communist background. And it tells the story about the books. It doesn't say they were Nancy Drew books. Talks about they were advocating the overthrow of Mississippi, like that. And this guy is actually an English fella that was arrested with us at some point. So the headline, one says, local civil rights worker has communist background, and it shows my picture. And this picture was taken, by the way, at one of the Freedom Days that Les was talking about, where we brought groups of people as an anti-fear thing, you know, strength in numbers, to the courthouse. And if you read the caption there, it doesn't say freedom. It says something about I look angry because I'm at a demonstration or something. I was angry. Oh yeah, it does say that. It was photographed as he led the voter registration drive here last Friday. That means Freedom Days. And it says he looks angry. No, he looks unhappy about something. I wasn't happy, probably either because it was hot or because they were taking my picture or whatever. But here it says, reckless driving arrest by sheriff. That's up here. Led to discovery of, quote, little black book and communist exposure. Maybe that means that Flick Ash, I haven't read that in years, decade. Maybe that means that Flick Ash stole my book. But it was a lie. That was not a little black book. That was a little reddish brown book. And in somewhere here they say, that's why they put little black book in quotes. They don't say it was a little, they don't explain why, but it was no little black book. But I just figured that out. If it was arrest by sheriff on reckless driving, that was up here. If it was about the printed material crap, it was down in Oxford. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Yeah. Somewhere in Holly Springs or Marshall County is my little black book in their records.
You never got it back?
No.
You mean red book?
The little red book. Well, it's a reddish brown book. Yeah, it was, that's what they call it, yeah. So, but there's something even more important that I want to show you. This is from the same issue. And they got me in the paper a lot because they wanted to show that the movement wasn't a black movement, it was led by this white Jewish communist. Which as soon as this came out, I came to the director, whose name was Ivanhoe Donaldson, who was black. I said, Ivanhoe, I never said I was in charge of anything, because I was more afraid of him than anybody. I didn't say I'm leading anything. That's a lie.
The whole other slide is for no room for communists.
That's right.
That's funny.
Yeah. They devoted the whole front page. No room for communists. The whole front page was devoted to that. But they did that a lot. They put me in a paper. But I was not a leader of anything whatsoever. I was helping the black leaders, and I just literally did what they told me to do. And if it was lick envelopes all day, I did. That was our role as whites, our being whites. But the more important thing is this. Can you focus in on this? See, it says, list of application for registration. And this was in every issue. If you were black and you went to the courthouse and applied to register, this is step before registering. They put your name in the paper and your address.
Wow.
And that was very dangerous. I mean, if you were black and you were a sharecropper, chances are you would be put off your land. If you worked for a white guy, you were fired. You know? And if you, I don't know, chances, but you had a good chance of being beaten. And, well, we had one guy killed. There's the interesting side story to this. As sharecroppers were put off their land, other sharecroppers took them in and hid them. There's several stories like that.
I was actually going to ask you to talk about that. So do you know of any stories like that where
yes.
white landowners took in?
Oh, no. No, I meant black. Black landowners and sharecroppers. No whites. Had I known you were going to ask me that question, I wrote up a report. We sent in weekly reports about just this one thing. We heard Miss Gibson, and I told you there's just 3 names in Holly Springs, maybe 5. Everybody, I'm kidding. But I'm not kidding much. But anyway, cause I'm saying that because I can't remember her first name. Was standing in line to register to vote, and to apply to register to vote. And a friend of the white woman she worked for saw her and said, I can't remember her name, but I remember her last name was Gibson, that she's going to tell Miss Annie, you know, whoever the woman that she worked for, I want to tell, you know, Miss Sally that I saw you here. And we heard about this. And another worker and I tracked her down the very next day, and her family had been put out of her house. And she wouldn't tell me where she was living, which I didn't blame her. But later on, you know, as you build trust, things happen. The person who was keeping her who was a sharecropper, but at another, they call them farms, they're plantations, at another plantation, said, you know, Miss Gibson wants you to know that she's okay and she's staying with us, and like that. And she followed through and registered, because by that time, they had sent federal registers down to keep things straight. So I'm condensing maybe 8 months worth of stuff into one. But although, you know, the term black community is meaningless. I mean, it's like saying the white community. I mean, it's just, you know. But on this issue, at that time, people came together. People hadn't spoken to each other in 30 years, came together to help each other.
Does anybody else have any questions? I would like to thank you so much for your time. It was an honor to learn from you today and share this time and space with you. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and conclude the interview at this point.
Thank you.
Here to these elevators, and then they put it out on parties. So you see a lot of things, and we rice that being farmed out there, they're loaded in This is actually one of the only pieces of furniture that we actually were able to locate that belonged to this building. And it was actually found out in the western part of the county, the telegraph operator desk.